When I first saw Hook in 1991, I remember really enjoying it. Maybe it was because I was such a young kid, but this movie had a really magical feel to it, and I was really immersed in it. This is probably the movie I watched the most as a kid. For that reason, I was surprised to see that the reviews of this movie weren't that great. I heard that even Steven Spielberg wished he had done something better, or even turned it into a musical. Personally, I'm not a fan of musicals, so I'm glad he didn't do that. I recently rewatched Hook, and even though it didn't feel as magical as it did 32 years ago, I thought it was quite enjoyable, and deserves more praise than what it usually gets. Even though the reviews were not great, Hook was very popular at the time. Everyone I knew at school saw it, and as you would expect from such a popular movie, a lot of merchandise has been created based on this movie. And video games were no exception. A pinball machine, an arcade game, and a few console games were made based on Hook. As for myself, I rented the NES Hook game once and thought it was pretty good. Maybe I'll do a review of it someday. I also saw my friend play the SNES game for a few minutes at his house. I thought it looked a lot more fun than the NES game and figured I should rent it sometime, but for some reason I never got to rent it. Now that I recently rewatched the Hook movie, while it is still fresh in my mind, I thought it was the perfect time to finally give the SNES Hook game a try. In this video, I share my experience of playing Hook for the SNES. When we start the game, the first thing we see is the Sony Imagesoft logo. If I am not mistaken, Sony Imagesoft is the predecessor of Sony Interactive Entertainment. I was happy to see the Sony Imagesoft logo because they released some amazing games like Smart Ball, Equinox, and Solstice. After the logo splash screen, you have an opening cutscene. This game has several cutscenes. They're pretty static and there's not much going on. The text also scrolls too slowly, which makes the cutscenes drag on longer than they should. Still, it's always nice to have cutscenes in a game. They help give context to what you're doing and make the game more immersive. In these cutscenes, the pixel rendition of all the characters from the movie is really cute. They did a great job making Robin Williams look angry and out of shape like he was in the movie before becoming Peter Pan. It's really impressive how they managed to make such tiny sprites have different facial expressions. His kid's school uniform also looks pretty cool. Also, the framing of this scene with the big moon on the left is really nice. On the right, you have the warmth, comfort, and security of home. You can also faintly see a clock in the background, which in the Hook universe somehow represents the world of grown-ups. It's kind of a predicament of what's to come. I wonder if the developers put that there on purpose. On the left, you have the opposite, a large moon in the night that could represent the fun, excitement, and danger of an adventure. Then, when you press start to begin your adventure, you hear a 16-bit rendition of a melody that plays a few times in the movie, such as during the banquet scene. Perhaps because his music tends to be very melodic, but John Williams' soundtrack works amazingly well in 16-bit video game music. And in addition to John Williams' music, original music has also been created for this game. For example, there's a really cool jingle at the end of each stage. The bass is made with trumpet samples and sounds like something you would hear in a game like ActRaiser. Your character even raises his sword like in ActRaiser. It makes you feel pumped up and ready for the next stage. It is not an exaggeration to say that a colossal amount of work has gone into the soundtrack of this game. In my opinion, the music alone makes this game worth playing. One interesting thing to note is that the Sega CD port of this game uses fully orchestrated Red Book audio. You might think this is the superior version of Hook, but I don't think so. It doesn't work that well with the pixel art aesthetic of the game. It feels a bit out of place. It doesn't sound like old school video game music enough. And maybe it's because I grew up with this console, but there's a special magic to SNES music that can't be replicated anywhere else. Besides the amazing music, another thing that immediately caught my attention in the opening cutscene was the cute pixel art rendition of all the characters from the movie. I also noticed that in this game, Robin Williams is the same height as the Lost Boys. I don't remember Robin Williams being that short, so I thought that was pretty funny. But they probably just made the Lost Boys bigger so they could add more detail to the sprites. Also, since they act as enemies in the first stage, they would have been too hard to hit if they were very small sprites. And that first stage where the Lost Boys train you to become Peter Pan is a great example of how expressive and detailed all the enemy and character sprites are. For example, if you defeat a Lost Boy, since they are not real enemies, of course they won't die. Instead, you see a neat animation of them surrendering. They could have just disappeared, like in most other platformers would have done. That is some pretty cool attention to detail. And when you're the one who's defeated, you revert back to old fat Robin Williams and get thrown off the stage like in Super Mario Bros. I thought that was pretty clever and funny. And for an SNES game, your character have a wide variety of animations. For example, there is a different animation for running and walking. And when you change direction, there's also a little drift animation. The enemies don't have as many animations, but they still have a high level of detail. Thudbutt even has his trademark rolling ability. All enemies have this high level of detail, and there's a lot of them too. Each stage has at least one new enemy, and with a total of 12 stages, that's quite a lot of enemies. I feel like 12 stages makes Hook a pretty big game. During the NES and SNES era, most games had around 8 stages. There's also a wide variety of environments. Almost every stage has a different background art. Like the character sprites, these environments are filled with cool details. For example, in the first stage, the weather changes to depict all 4 seasons. In the same stage, there are 4 different color schemes with weather effects like rain, falling leaves, and even snow. This adds a cool atmosphere to the stage. This is a really impressive first stage that will make you want to play until you beat the game. The first few minutes of a game are really important, and I think the developer understood that very well. In the second stage, if you look closely at the background, you can see rays of sunlight shining through the leaves of the trees. This is a really beautiful detail. One thing that is not as impressive is the controls. The way your character jumps is very floaty. I know he's Peter Pan, so that's on purpose, but it just doesn't feel that great. For example, in the second stage, there are bees that move very fast. Because of the slow and floaty controls, they are hard to avoid. However, one good thing about floaty jumps is that they allow you to reach very distant platforms. Also, you walk very slowly. You can run, but it takes a long time to get momentum to run fast. You can also fly with fairy dust, but only for a very short time. But that's not too bad, because Julia Roberts as the fairy Tinkerbell can be found in many places to give you the fairy dust that lets you fly. You get to fly a lot in this game, which is a good thing because it's pretty fun. If you hold down the Y button while flying, you fly really fast and can access places that would otherwise be inaccessible. Flying that fast is really satisfying. However, since you have less time to react, you often end up crashing into walls and such. As for fighting, your main weapon is a knife, which has a very small hitbox, so you have to get really close to enemies to hit them. It is the kind of game where you have to be slow and meticulous. You cannot rush through it. After the first stage, you get a sword that has a longer range and can fire projectiles, but if you get hit only once, you lose it and go back to the knife. So you have to be careful not to get hit. Speaking of fighting enemies, Hook is the kind of game where defeated enemies automatically respawn when leaving the screen and coming back. In games like Ninja Gaiden, constantly respawning enemies is pretty annoying and can cause you to fall into pits. But in Hook, with the way the stages are designed, it didn't bother me that much. This also allows you to farm extra lives that enemies drop. Since this game is quite challenging, it might be worth it. In this game, human enemies also drop jewelry that gives you points. I guess it makes sense that animals and monsters don't have any jewelry on them. I thought that was an interesting detail. The other enemies don't give you anything, so you can just avoid them. To stay on the subject of battles, as you can expect if you have seen the movie before, the boss of the first stage is Rufio. Bangarang Rufio. When I was a kid, my friend and I thought Rufio was the coolest character ever. He had really cool punk hair. Even now I still think he looks cool. Once you learn his pattern, he's not too hard to beat. In Hook, the bosses are not that difficult. But the controls add some challenge to the game. They are not terrible, but I just feel that they are not the strongest point of the game. I just wish they were more like a traditional platforming game. Well, at least the button layout is very traditional. Just like in Super Mario Bros., you press the B button to jump and the Y button to perform an attack. In Super Mario Bros., it doesn't matter too much that the attack button is the same as the run button, because unless you're really good and never get hit, you won't have access to the fireball that often. But in Hook, you're attacking all the time, so it would have been more convenient to have a different button for running. It would have been nice if we could use the R or L button to run like in some modern games. But at the time this game was made, that control scheme wasn't popular, so it's understandable that this control scheme is not available. Another thing that adds to the challenge of the game is your life bar. At the beginning of the game, you lose your life after being hit only 3 times. Later in the game, you can find items that extend your health bar, which makes things a little easier. but overall, it is still quite a challenging game. After you defeat Rufio, you can see your character on an overworld map as he moves to the next stage. Even though you cannot walk freely on it, this map is really a great addition to the game. It makes you feel like you're in a cohesive world and not just moving from one random stage to another. It also makes the game feel much bigger than it actually is. I really appreciate when games have overworld maps. Even though Hook is a very linear game, there are sometimes different paths you can take in a stage. For example, in this second stage, you can either walk on the ground or walk on the branches from one tree to another. Besides that, this game doesn't have much replay value. There are also some auto-scrolling levels. It's always nice to have a few of these to mix things up. Overall, I really enjoyed Hook for the SNES. The gameplay is not the best, but the amazing music and beautiful graphics make up for it. It is definitely a must-play for any fan of old-school side-scrollers. I'd even go so far as to say that I had more fun playing the game than watching the movie. This game also made me reflect on my own life. When Hook came out, I was about the same age as the Lost Boys. Now in my late 30s, I'm about the same age as Robin Williams in the movie. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time to be a child again, to simpler times. Sometimes I wish there was a Neverland I could escape to, but I must learn to appreciate the present moment and look forward to the adventures that await me in the future. And like Peter said in the movie, to live would be an awfully big adventure. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.